I believe consciousness is fundamental. Consciousness is the primary stuff this universe is made of. It's the essential nature of reality. Indian religions have taught us this for millennia already, and modern philosophy and even science has been catching up. After all, everything we experience in consciousness, meaning in a subjective awareness. And in fact, as Advaita Vedanta teaches, I believe that everything is made up of and is nothing other than consciousness. But does that mean that everything is conscious? Ever since Thomas Nagel, most people would agree on the definition that a conscious being means that there is something it is like to be that being. It's sentient, it has perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. It has a mental inner life, and we can notice this mental inner life through behavior. If I step on a dog's tail, it'll react. It'll react in a similar way to how I would if someone stepped on my foot. We can guess at what's conscious by extrapolating what it's like for ourselves to be conscious. And in that way, it may be easy to see how other living beings are conscious, other humans, animals, and maybe even plants. Because of our separate inner lives, we express our own will independently of others. We want things and move toward them. In that way, even this plant can be considered conscious. It wants water and its roots will move toward a water source. It wants sunlight and it'll grow in the direction of it. But can we take it further? What about inanimate objects? Are rocks conscious? I mean, it doesn't seem like this rock is conscious. It's not doing anything. It doesn't move. I can step on it, and the only reaction I will get may be from security. But if we take a broader perspective, rocks can seem to be very active. Zooming even further out, the universe is expanding. Planets move, stars are born and die. The universe at large does seem to be doing something and going somewhere. Taken as a whole, nature does seem to be as dynamic as we are. So maybe the non-living universe as a whole has a conscious inner life too. It has subjective experience that we don't see. Bernardo Kastrup equates a rock to a single neuron in our brain. We don't assume that a single neuron is conscious, but all of the neuronal activity taken together represents what our private inner thoughts look like from the outside. Our nervous system as a whole is conscious, and in that way, the universe as a whole may be conscious too. I mentioned Donald Hoffman in my last video, and I like the way he describes it. Everything has the potential to be a portal into consciousness. If consciousness is underlying everything, it may just be a matter of whether or not we can see through the appearance of something to notice the reality of consciousness behind it. I can recognize specific activities of consciousness in myself and other humans, and I can notice it in the behavior of animals. But once they start to look smaller down to an insect, I'm not so sure. And then down to an amoeba, I just can't tell at that point. I can't discern possible conscious behavior so different from my own. Our limited evolutionary perceptions then give up when trying to look through the portal of a rock or anything inanimate. But it doesn't mean that consciousness isn't there. Consciousness may be the only thing that's ultimately real. And in investigating reality, we have good reason to start with consciousness. As far as we can tell, everything is in consciousness. Even everything in the so-called physical world is in consciousness. Our perceptions of the world are, after all, conscious activity. We are aware of what we perceive. We can never experience anything outside of consciousness. If I take a picture of this scenery with my eyes closed, I can't see it and I'm not experiencing it visually. But then I have this picture and I can say, see, there's a standalone physical reality out there outside of my consciousness. Here's picture proof of it. And we could be more rigorous and do scientific experiments to show the consistency of an outside world independent of consciousness. Or can we? Is it really all independent of consciousness? If I have a picture someone else took of a place I've never been to, but I'm looking at it right now, I'm now experiencing it in my subjective awareness, in my consciousness. If I read a scientific study, I become consciously aware of it. And any objective scientific study has to be conducted by conscious individuals and apprehended in consciousness. Has anyone ever found a physical world that can be experienced outside of consciousness? However, materialists believe that physical substances are primary and give rise to consciousness, that matter comes first, and that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of it. But their worldview has one problem, one hard problem. In coining that phrase, David Chalmers contributed a lot to our understanding of consciousness as it relates to the physical world. There's nothing in the physical world we can use to deduce subjective experience or consciousness. For example, scientists have not been able to show anything about the movement or interactions of atoms in our brains that could give rise to the taste of chocolate, to the scent of a rose, or the feeling of falling in love. There are neural correlates of consciousness, but no evidence that neurons cause consciousness. In fact, neurons may not even physically exist in and of themselves, outside of consciousness. Nothing physical may. And yet, if there's one thing we know to exist, it's consciousness. We all experience it. What we don't experience is a physical world outside of consciousness. There are implications of quantum physics that seem to support this worldview against a standalone physical reality. And there's the work by Donald Hoffman that I talked about in my last video. So even science has never found a physical world outside of consciousness. But assuming a standalone physical reality does seem to make sense at first. There seems to be a big difference between the outside physical world and our personal mental activity. The physical world has regular laws, and we can't control the world at large with our individual minds alone. In our individual minds, our thoughts are fickle and fleeting. The laws of nature are patterned and consistent. Our individual thoughts can't directly and immediately change the physical world the same way our thoughts can directly and immediately influence or evoke another thought in our own minds. But we may be conflating our form of consciousness with what may be considered a transpersonal or universal consciousness. We may be confusing our personal and limited minds with a universal and unlimited consciousness. It's a distinction between minds and consciousness that Vedanta makes. Our minds may just be a limited reflection of a universal consciousness. So to distinguish consciousness at large from our limited version of it, perhaps we can use another definition of consciousness. Consciousness is the knowing element behind all experiences. It's the knower or experiencer itself. It's the subject of objective experiences. It's what we mean when we refer to I, but not the I qualified by personal memories, beliefs, desires, tendencies, and descriptions. The pure I, the pure subject. That constant knowing element behind all of our changing memories, beliefs, desires, tendencies, and descriptions. And this consciousness is the most familiar and intimate experience we have. But again, what about non-living things? What about rocks? Donald Hoffman says asking if rocks are conscious may be an invalid question. He would argue that nothing physical is conscious in and of itself. Nothing in space and time is conscious. Consciousness is a reality beyond space-time, beyond the physical. As physical bodies, we're not conscious. In fact, nothing we perceive is conscious. As Rupert Spira likes to say, only consciousness is conscious. There's only Schopenhauer's one eye of the world which looks out from all-knowing creatures, meaning a pure consciousness that takes on the apparent form of ourselves, animals, and the universe at large. The multiplicity of things we see, including ourselves and other living beings, are only appearances or representations of the only consciousness that exists, the single consciousness underlying all of reality. This single consciousness is what we really are. In this framing, when we say that we are conscious and rocks are not, what we're really saying is that we can see the consciousness in us, and we can't see it in rocks. The one consciousness expressed as an individual person has a personal discrete mind. I have a sense of self that's unique to me, and personal memories and desires. Because of that, I act with volition that's specific to my unique thoughts, impulses, and interests. I have a will that drives me. This is why Schopenhauer called the one subjectivity underlying all of reality the will. And while we may not notice that will in rocks, it doesn't mean it's not there in the entire universe at large. According to Bernardo Kastrup, we're dissociated from the one universal consciousness. And what this dissociation looks like physically is metabolizing life. Humans, animals, and plants. Rocks are not metabolizing living creatures. And so in this model, they are not dissociated consciousnesses. They don't have private inner lives. They don't have minds, but they are still in consciousness. Consciousness is a field of awareness in which all of our thoughts and feelings arise. It's a field of awareness in which all of our perceptions of a physical world arise. From our human perspective, it gives rise to a physical world around us and a mental world within us. And we may not be able to get the rock's perspective, but if only we can get a universal perspective. Like and comment if this resonated with you, and subscribe below to follow me on my journey. See you next time.